So I think what really sort of got me to write this book, Beyond the Fields, was to sort of say, hey, you know, what an amazing incubator. You know, you look at all these things, and again about with Gary, because Gary, who spent his entire life in the labor movement, Kevin O'Connor, who's also is still at Local 2 Unite Here. Bill Gramfield was here tonight, is with the head of Local 100 Unite Here in New York. People who got their entry through the farm workers, got their training, got their skills, and have been the leaders in labor and in other social movements. It's 40 years later, and it's really remarkable how one organization spawned so many people. I describe in the book how Justice for Janitors started. People have heard SAU's Justice for Janitors. Stephen Lerner, an ex-UFW boycott organizer in New York, was trying to figure out how to organize janitors who used to be organized but then lost their contracts in the 80s, and how to restart it. And he thought, gee, you know, janitors are a lot like farm workers in high-rises, you know? And he and Susan Sation, another UFW alum, go out to Denver in the 80s and start this thing called Justice for Janitors. It really takes off, becomes so successful that now people would say, oh, Justice for Janitors, Latino janitors, they're easy to organize. You know, no big deal. There's no challenge. They all want to join unions. But when it started, it was like, Latinos who don't speak English, a lot of them, you can't organize that group. It's impossible. Once you succeed using the farm worker organizing methods, you know, now it's like, well, that was easy. So there's so many stories of people who came up from the UFW and ended up dedicating their lives, and it's really unique. You know, people often say, what about, you know, there's other movements that come on for short periods of time and then kind of disintegrate. But what was special about the UFW and what it imparted was it believed it had a mission to train all of their volunteers in the discipline of organizing. So when you left there, you could take those skills to the next level. I discuss it a lot. If you know Fred Ross Jr., Fred Ross Sr.'s son, after he left the UFW, started a group called Neighbor to Neighbor, which was the one of the leading groups against military aid to Central America. And Fred started this group, and I have a roster, I have a chart in the book of like all these people, 250 people who went through these groups and doing good stuff today. The people that Neighbor to Neighbor trained ended up, to this day, still being organizers and still involved in social justice. And Fred had learned about the success of the boycotts of the farm workers. He thought, well, the only way we can really put pressure on the El Salvador government is to have a coffee boycott. And that coffee boycott was so phenomenally successful that that was one of the major reasons that the civil war in El Salvador ended. And I describe in the book how that all took place. And what's interesting, I have a picture in the book of a press conference with the ILWU. The ILWU would not let any any ship carrying El Salvadoran coffee dock on the West Coast because there was outreach there. And I have a picture of people who were at this rally in 1987 for the coffee boycott, and in the background of the picture is a woman named Todo, who went on to become International Vice President to this day of Unite Here. So the Unite Here people picked up on these other boycotts. So in 2006, when Unite Here is in this big fight with the hotel industry, what do they think about doing as a strategy? A hotel boycott. And I knew in San Francisco there had been these hotel boycotts that went on for years, just out of the farm worker playbook. When they were training people for the 2006 boycott, they showed videos to Unite Here folks around the country of Cesar Chavez and the Great Boycott to show you the ongoing legacy. I didn't know that Local 2 in San Francisco, where Mike Casey's been president for some time, if any of you know Mike, I never thought of Mike as a farm worker person. I thought he learned it from other people. Mike was trained by Fred Ross Sr. and got his start at the Farm Labor Organizing Committee, which was an offshoot inspired in Ohio, Baldemar Velasquez, of Cesar Chavez. So the legacy is astonishing. And that's what the book Beyond the Fields kind of traces, is how it goes in all these directions. And people take it in places where many people aren't even aware the UFW was involved, such as the environmental justice movement, where people don't even think of the farm workers as part of as launching the environmental justice movement, because when the farm workers did it, the words environmental justice didn't exist. In 1969, the farm workers were battling DDT and pesticides in the fields, and the Sierra Club, you know, at that point was like, environmentalism, that's lakes and mountains and clean water, and not pesticides in the Central Valley fields affecting workers. That's not an environmental issue. Cesar Chavez tried to get the Sierra Club on his side. The UFW could have ended the grape boycott earlier and signed contracts with grape growers if they would just agree to do what the Teamsters did, which was let them spray out whatever they want, anyone they want. Cesar wouldn't agree to that. The pesticide issue was front and center, and I described in a chapter how this whole process took place of the UFW trying to convince environmental groups to fight to stop DDT and other carcinogens, and the success they had. So in the legacy, this goes beyond even the labor movement to the environmental movement. It also goes into the political movement. I have a couple chapters on, you know, this is the paperback version of the book. The hardback version came out just as I was reading stories that Barack Obama's 2008 campaign had reinvented electoral outreach. And the Washington Post and others wrote stories saying, no one has ever seen anything like it. The organizers, they don't just ask for your vote, but they go to the door and they engage with you in a conversation, and they try to recruit you to be an organizer. They try to recruit you to join the field campaign. And that's just, we've never heard of this before. Well, if you read the book, you'll see that's what the UFW was doing in 1968 in California when they were working on the Robert Kennedy campaign. That's what they were doing in 1972 in California, in 1976 in California. That's exactly what they did. They even set up a tent city in a Los Angeles park so farm workers would come in the fields and live in the tents and go out and organize. So the whole Latino organizing, which has really taken off, and I describe in the book in 2006 and 2008, how it really started from the farm worker electoral outreach model from the 60s and 70s, taken by Miguel Contreras to Los Angeles, where he transformed the whole politics of Los Angeles. Los Angeles is another city that now is considered a labor town. Before Miguel Contreras arrived, it was a Republican town and labor had no power. So that's a classic example of how he brought the farm worker methods to LA County Federation of Labor and really transformed the political environment there. And then it was taken to California and other states, the Southwest, by farm worker veterans. So that's sort of what, you know, the book talks about. All these things that people sort of think just came out of the air now do have a legacy, including the immigrant rights movement, where it was really farm worker people, like people like Fred Ross Jr., Eliseo Medina, Miguel Contreras, who really pushed to get labor to switch their view on immigrants. Because people here may not know, labor historically has been anti-immigrant. They thought immigrants took jobs, and that's for the whole history of the labor movement until 1999, when Eliseo Medina, working with John Wilhelm, got the AFL-CIO to switch their position in 2000. And when you wonder why there were so many people in the streets in 2006, it's because the sort of the UFW coalition, which the UFW being the first labor movement to really recruit students, the church, you know, other unions, get it all in a big coalition. That's what you saw in the streets in 2006. And Unite Here and other unions and did this whole immigrant workers freedom ride. I don't know if any of you were involved in that in 2003, which became sort of the training ground, the prep for the big 2006 marches. So, you know, I go across the board and trace, you know, from the 60s to the present, all these movements and how they're antecedents with UFW. And of course, because the title of the book is Beyond the Fields, it means that all these great organizers left the UFW. And I think that one of the things I think is that my book is different from any other thing written on the UFW is kind of, other books have said, look at the current status of farm workers today. Look what happened in the late 70s, early 80s, and the farm worker movement failed, the UFW failed, without realizing that you don't measure success by the current membership numbers in the UFW. You remember it by the rich legacy. Because, as I describe in a chapter in the book, and that many of you may know, starting in the late 70s, the reason so many of these talented people left the UFW was because Cesar Chavez, for a number of reasons that I think have almost mental health basis, they were so bizarre, sort of drove all the top leadership out of the union. made it impossible for them to stay, which is very sad. And I discuss all the details, and many of it's written about, but I do think what has happened is there's so much focus on those years in the late 70s, early 80s, where people left, that people forget that people like Bill Granfield here are working in Unite here, building unions here, that Gary Gutman is still, a labor organizer, that Fred Ross, all these folks are still organizing and have done great things since leaving, but for the UFW, they wouldn't have ever had the chance. And you would not have seen Sharon DeLuca spend the last 40 years working for social change in a lot of fields. So many of the people I talk about in the book, especially the women, had they not been given that opportunity. So you have to look at the big picture of what the legacy of the UFW is.